Hi everyone, and welcome to this special episode of Low Season Traveller Insider Guides. I'm your host, Jed Brown, founder of Low Season Traveller, and some of you may know that we're working very closely with both the World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage and also My Travel Research. As part of this relationship, we've been organising a series of tourism recovery webinars where we speak to global industry leaders from the tourism industry and seek to learn how we can come out of this current situation with more resilience. Our third keynote of the series was with Professor John Koldowski from Leshan Normal University in China. And as with previous episodes in this special series, this is the Q&A session which followed the keynote. I hope you find this interesting, and we'll bring you the Q&A from every session as we move forward. Enjoy. Thanks a million for that, John. Really fascinating presentation. And I've got to say, generally, sort of looking through the presentation and listening to you, John, I actually think that's quite optimistic in many cases. We saw you had some figures there from Parter, which was showing these three potential outcomes, which was, the sort of expected, the most likely scenario for recovery over the next sort of year, 2 years, the optimistic and the pessimistic. And I don't know if I was on my own, but I was actually quite pleasantly surprised. I thought, actually, that really doesn't look, even the pessimistic didn't look too bad. I think, as I recall, on the pessimistic, we were looking at recovering to 90% of 2019 levels by 2021. It's not that bad, is it?
It's not bad. These things can change on a dime. Now, the original forecasts were created in November of last year, November, December, and then they were modified again in January, February. We're now into May, and so it may well be that they may occur as planned. They may not. Everything is variable. But given the science that goes into and behind these data, I would certainly use them as a yardstick, bearing in mind there's variation around that, as some sort of yardstick as to what might be possible. And it also helps to at least be able to see this light at the end of the tunnel and suggest that, look, yeah, we could be here. Whether we are there, different issue.
Absolutely. I was on a session yesterday, a different session, and I mentioned this off air, but I wanted to get your thoughts on this. One of the listeners had come in with a question saying that they were getting tired of people talking about what travel and tourism would be like in the post-COVID world, because they were saying, that they were of the opinion that we're never going to lose coronavirus. There has been a strain of coronavirus, well, at least since 2002, 2003, when we had SARS. This one obviously is a different strain, but it is a coronavirus. So is it wrong of us to talk about the post-COVID world when actually we should be talking about how we can learn to live with COVID better, so that it doesn't negatively affect our lives and the planet as much?
That's a great position, and it's one that I absolutely agree with, that we're not going to go back to what we were before at all. We are going to have to learn to live with this particular coronavirus and whatever else is coming out of the woodwork as we go forward.
Oh, we've lost your sound again. Well, where's my sign? We've lost your sound again, John. Can you read that? I don't know if my sign's not as good as yours, Carolyn. We've lost your sound again, mate. We'll try and get... Oh, Carolyn's coming on. Come on, Carolyn, join us. Your sound's gone. Try and say something, John. No, we still can't hear you. Nope, I'm afraid the sound has gone again. The gremlins are back. That's a shame, because I really was interested to get John's take on that. Let's just wait and see if the sound will... Oh, there we go. You're back. Go on, John.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now, mate. We can't see you anymore. No, I can't see you, but we can hear you.
I can see myself. Okay.
Well, that's good. You can talk to yourself then, but we can all hear you anyway. That's the main thing.
I've done that before, don't worry. I agree entirely with that position that this particular coronavirus and other viruses that we have not even encountered yet are all part of this biosphere that we live with. We have to learn to live with them. We will never conquer them. They were here before us, and they'll probably be here long after we're gone. So it's not a situation of humankind dominating nature at all. It is about humankind recognizing that we have to live with nature, and this is very much the case with coronavirus. We may develop some sort of immunities to it, but there'll be something else at some point downstream. I'm reminded of, I think it comes from seismology, when they say that the further away you are from your last crisis, the closer you are to your next one. And that's the sort of situation we're going to find ourselves in. We're going to be moving from one to another. It just depends on how we learn to react to these sorts of intrusions. But I agree entirely with that. It's not going away.
So, I mean, what's interesting is, one of the crises that we, actually Chris Flynn, our chairman and president, covered this off in the last session last Thursday. We were talking about the past crises that we've had and what we've learned from them. And one of the last crises that we had that literally changed the way we travel was 9/11. Post 9/11, all of a sudden, we all had these different security checks in airports, and, in some airports, we have to take our shoes off. In others, we don't, and it depends where you are in the world. But generally, travel became more miserable. Is that the kind of change that we're going to see now moving forward? Certainly in the case of air travel, where we're just going to have to go through more checks. So not as much on the security. We'll have all the same checks that we had on security. But in terms of hygiene, are we just going to have a whole new round of checks that we're going to have to go through before we even get in the airport, let alone get on a plane?
It could well be. I noted here that at one point, if you wanted to fly out of China to a destination, you had to produce a document from a doctor within 48 hours saying that you were not infected. Now, maybe that's something we have in the future, is some sort of mechanism that...
You're gone again, John. Okay, we'll try and get John back. I can hear somebody.
You can hear me, Jed. I'm holding up the "we can't hear you" sign for John.
Yeah, good one. I don't think he could see me before either, which is not so good. Let me just have a look at some of the other questions that have been coming in.
Would you like me to summarise them for you, Jed?
Yeah, absolutely. Come and show your face, Carolyn.
I am showing my face to everyone else. You can't see me, Jed.
Oh, is it just me that I can't see you? So Carolyn is our producer for the whole series as well.
Yes, so yeah, I'm not sure today's the day I want to own up to that, Jed, but I think we're competing for a lot of bandwidth today. So yeah, I think that's probably part of the issue. Is we're now Australia, for those people who aren't familiar, we decided to save a frugal 10 billion and land us all with fibre to the node. So we're safely there. I think that's probably the questions that I've seen so far. I'd like to give a shout out to Gary, who is loving the gremlins. I have to say he's probably on his own on that. He's actually sat on an island off Tasmania drinking cab sav and having Tasmanian cheddar, so the world looks very rosy to him.
Nice.
Very nice. Most of the questions seem to be about the forecasts, and it's kind of falling into two categories from what I've seen, Jed. And hopefully we can get John's sound back on that too. The first is a lot of people saying I was pleasantly surprised too, and then some slightly more suspicious characters of whom I would probably put myself, who are, is it too good to be true? Is it because it was too early? Do we have any sense of how things might look there? And then some people saying, look, perhaps when I've just seen Georgina's got a comment about sharing some of the infographics. We will be sharing the entire presentation, Georgina. But basically, particularly those part of breakdown, optimistic, pessimistic, some skepticism around those, and some saying, well, it almost looks like it started to fall in 2019, but I don't know if that's just the visuals. So you might just want to click back to that slide if you can hear me, John, to have a quick look at that and perhaps use that, and perhaps possibly also we do have a chat facility, John, which you should be able to share us some comments if you aren't able to get your sound back.
Okay, you can't hear me at the moment?
Oh, we can hear you. We can hear you, John. You come back now.
Okay. Well, let me start by saying that I'm like you, Caroline. I'm extremely skeptical of forecasts and projections, but in working with these from Parter over the last decade or so, I've found that even when I was dubious, they normally came to fruition within about 2% of actual. So, yeah, there's a lot of science that goes behind this. These are not the back of a serviette type of projections. There's a lot of very detailed and very complicated econometrics that go into this. But having said that, everything changes. I mean, if you look at the IMF World Outlook forecasts in October, they always revise them again in April because things change that quickly in today's world that you can't really with any certainty say that this is what it's going to be like in 2 years' time or 3 years' time or the like. So yeah, I'm always skeptical, but I've got to pin my hopes and aspirations on something, and yes, these are the best that I've come across in my years of dealing with this.
I used to have this when I worked at IATA, John, and I would have every year, there were lots of people who are very skeptical about the IATA forecasts. But I think, you know, if we looked back over a 50-year period, actually the IATA forecasts were on average the most accurate and predictive. So I think you're right, we have to go with that. We've had quite a lot of questions also coming up around this idea of, you know, where from here and how do we solve this? So questions around what kind of health checks we need, and do we risk, if we open things up, going into a second wave of the pandemic, which I think kind of links to Jed's question. So I'm going to throw that to the pair of you to chat through.
That's one thing that I in particular am very concerned about, because at the moment we've got a situation where this particular virus seems to thrive in cold climates. It doesn't mean that it dies off in the tropics, not by any stretch of imagination. It's still viable in the tropics. But what does that mean in the future when you've got people in the cold climates of North Europe and East Europe and so forth want to come down to Southeast Asia to get some warmth? Are we actually bringing in something that then has to be dealt with on the ground in the tropics? And this is what I mean by this seasonality factor. The fact that we're going not so much from month to month, but from a cold to a warm, warm to a cold, etc., etc. Could that lead to a second wave? Yes, it could. And that possibility could lead to the fact that we might need some sort of certificate or health certificate or whatever before we're even allowed to board a flight from point A to point B. It's like a visa. You may in fact have to produce that sort of health documentation in getting a visa to go to some countries. So it's going to be a change, but I don't think it's going to be that much of a change at the airport proper.
John, if we need to have some kind of a health check to, so I go and see my my doctor, and I have a test, and I haven't got coronavirus. What's to stop me from catching it as soon as I walk out the door, on my way to the airport, on the bus to the airport?
Absolutely nothing. But
what use is that? What use is that certificate? That's not going to allow me to travel. The only way to do it would be, as far as I can tell, is literally at the entrance to the airport. You have the test, and only people that currently haven't got coronavirus can get into the airport environment before boarding the plane, etc., etc.
Well, if it's got a 14-day incubation period, that's probably not going to work necessarily well either. But you can use that same argument to say that, well, I'm not going to drive to the airport because I couldn't get involved in a car accident, or I'm not going to do this because that might hurt me. We live in a turbulent time. We live in a time where there's threats all around us. We simply need to be acutely aware of what they are and how to minimise the effect of that on us. Maybe that's one way. Maybe what they're looking at now in some places is an immunity passport. How do you measure your immunity? And you might be immune to COVID-19. You might travel somewhere and you might catch something totally different. I mean, that's just the way it is, you know.
Do you think there's a need to start to look at balancing the risks, John, with this as well? You know, like you're sort of saying, look, a figure that's been quoted around many times is, the tens of thousands of people that die every year of the regular influenza. Is there a need to sort of balance the risks for the want of having some semblance of normality in our society?
Absolutely, I think yes, Jed. I mean, look how many people die in traffic accidents every year. We still drive. We sort of become immune to excuse the word, but become too familiar with it, and we accept that as a part of life. I'm not saying that this will necessarily go that way, but it's something that over time we will accept as this is a possibility, and I have to deal with that. Now, if there is some sort of immunity that can be created through whatever mechanism, then maybe I should take that. Yeah. One of the things I think will become a requirement, quite possibly, will be adequate insurance, so that if you fly from A to B and you get sick, that B is not saddled with the cost of hospitalisation, treatment, and then getting you back to your point of origin. So the insurance companies might be lining up to sort of say, well, we've got this sort of program that we can use, and that may become mandatory in some places. There will be changes. There's no question of that, but I'm not sure that we can actually get a 100% reliable on the spot, click you're through type of program. And
I suppose.
Sorry.
Go on, sorry. No, I was just going to say. I suppose the other side of this as well is there's the practicality of this coronavirus that exists, and we were both saying there before, it's not going to go away. It's always going to be there in some way, shape, or form. So we're going to have to learn to live with this, and maybe there'll be more hygiene checks and all of those kind of things. The other side of it is, I suppose it's the economic damage that's been done right now. So, we're talking an awful lot about, the recovery from, so, there are fewer cases in all of the different countries, and that's great. We're over the worst of it. Fantastic. When do we think is going to be the worst of it economically? Because governments around the world are promising, billions in recovery packages. Over here in the UK, they're giving 80% of people's salaries back to them for the furlough scheme. That's surely going to cost different generations, for years to come. When do you think we're going to hit the worst economically? And obviously, that's also going to have an effect on the travel and tourism industry, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we're talking years here, not months. It's already a situation where some of the upcoming generation are not going to be as well off as, for example, the boomers. We know that already in terms of their income, their assets, etc., etc. They're not going to be ahead of their parents and grandparents. And I think it's going to take a real shift in the way governments evaluate and structure their economies over the next decade. It's sort of that level of time that I'm looking at for this. There are already discussions about, as we get out of this, we need to take into consideration sustainability and the greening of all of this. Whether that becomes a part of it or not, we don't know. But if it doesn't, we're going to be in trouble still. But the short answer to your question is that, well, we're talking years.
Yeah.
I had to put a number on it, but it's
hard to put an exact number on it. Any more questions coming through, Carolyn, from the audience?
Yes, there are a few questions that are coming. So the health issue has come up again, but I think we may have covered some aspects of that. Some tension about whether the split might be between developed and less developed economies in terms of health checks is one area. And then two sides of the cost equation. So one side of it saying, well, look, we're going to have fewer airlines. And this came up a little bit with Chris's session last week as well, but I think it's an ongoing discussion, as you mentioned in one of the earlier webinars, Jed. So with fewer airlines around and fewer people allowed on them, how is the cost of air travel going to affect how quickly we come back? And then the other side of this is the discounting question, which is any thoughts on whether people should or shouldn't be discounting for things like accommodation? So health, higher costs because of fewer players, or lower costs as people try to stimulate the economy? Any thoughts on those three issues?
That's a really interesting balancing question, because a lot of economies around the world have seen a significant amount of money wiped off of their income sheets, and they're going to try and get that back. And they're going to try and get that back as quickly as possible. But the other side of that is, well, no, you can't do that. We need to be a little bit more standoffish about this. It will come back, but not within 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. It might take a year, it might take 2 years. So that is going to be a balancing act. The tendency to try and get short-term gain to offset the losses that we experienced through 2020 is going to be a difficult one to actually put aside. And we're seeing Donald Trump in the US doing that. He says he wants to open things up quickly to get the economy moving again. Well, that's great for the guys that are making money on that sort of growth, but it's not so fantastic for those that are not. And so the divide between the developed and the developing is going to be a big issue in that as well. Not the way we think. Quite possibly the developing economies are going to be the ones that need the money urgently, because they've got a big issue with poverty and unemployment, etc., etc. They may be opening up far more rapidly than some of the others who can afford to perhaps wait a while. With respect to aviation, maybe we are going to see a heck of a lot of airlines disappear, and maybe we are going to see consolidation. Maybe the cost of those flights are going to be higher, but then we look at alternatives. Does that mean that the rail network is going to improve? Is the road network going to improve? There are still issues with that. You can still catch COVID-19 travelling by rail, but there are alternate mechanisms to air. It's going to change the profile of travellers globally, though. There's no question about that. I've often wondered to myself as well that if I was flying again, would I pay a little bit more to travel in business class where I've got a greater separation, or be content to be stuffed down the back with quite a few hundred other people? It's going to be my behaviour and my mentality as well that's going to dictate how I fly, if I fly, when I fly. But above and beyond all of this, we have to change our own behaviour from it's all about me to I've got to consider those around me. So if I've got any basic sort of cold, yes, I'll wear a mask. If I need, I'll wear gloves. I'm aware of other people around me, not just myself. That's going to take some doing.
Yeah, are you optimistic that that's going to happen? Because I only say that because when I'm out and about in the UK and I'm in the supermarkets, we all know social distancing, and a lot of the supermarkets have got a one-way thing that you have to go around. The amount of people that ignore it is actually staggering. And what I'm finding really quite interesting is on a lot of where I live in a relatively small place, we have our Facebook social pages. And there's almost a lynch mob mentality for anybody that's perceived to be breaking the rules. And I find it really fascinating because I've never seen society turn on each other as vociferously as they're doing right now. So, on the pages this morning, it was, we saw somebody out at the park and there was 2 children there and they shouldn't be at the park. And you're starting to think, oh my God, is this also one of the societal effects of what we're going through right now, whereby we're starting to turn on each other? I mean, what's your take on that? Do you sort of see any evidence of that either at the moment or in the past?
We've seen it already. We've seen it where in the US, for example, people of Asian extraction are looked at like, whoa, you're Asian, therefore you must be Chinese, therefore you must be contaminated. And they're actually ostracized, even though they're probably 2nd or 3rd generation Americans. Yeah. We've seen it in Europe, where Asian groups were told to get off of trains and get off of buses and so forth. So this sort of mentality, self-protecting mechanism that avoid those people or treat them in that way, it's not a nice thing to see, but self-preservation, again, herd mentality takes over.
Yeah.
Not nice.
It's absolutely frightening. What about the point that Carolyn sort of brought up there about when we're talking about recovery in terms of the travel and tourism side for more of the developing nations around the world? Are they going to have a much different trajectory on their recovery?
I think they are, because they've got nothing else to fall back on in many cases. And it's not just the nations themselves, it's also subnational, where you're talking about some regions where the regional GDP is 80% driven by travel and tourism. Take that away and you've got a major problem. How do you fix that problem? How do you get the money to fix that problem? They're going to be looking for it. And one of the ways they might do that is to start looking at extractive approaches. Harvest the timber, to hell with that. We need the money now. Harvest the timber, cut down the virgin forest, dig the magnesium, dig deep, whatever. Are we going to go that way in the short term to try and make up for the money that we lost, so that we can actually continue to run the government? That's going to be a big thing. A lot of people are unemployed. If you're talking 75% of your regional GDP comes from travel and tourism, and then that drops to 0, wow, how do you survive? You have to get something.
It's a big issue, and as well, there's been a lot of talk, and you alluded to it with some of the IATA figures, about there being a reasonably high chance of there being significantly fewer airlines as we move out of this. And I was really struck by, in your presentation, you focused for a couple of slides on the oil crisis at the moment, in that, we've seen negative prices for the first time. What I was then starting to think is what's going to happen to the oil industry if we have a whole raft of bankruptcies in the aviation industry, and obviously they use an awful lot of fuel. What's going to happen to the oil industry? And then I started to think, is it actually in the oil industry's interests that there are airlines flying? Do you think conceivably the oil industry might actually start to prop up the aviation industry?
Good idea. Why not? Why not?
Yeah.
I mean, everything's possible. We're at a stage now where we have to try anything, and the more creative, the better. It might not work, but it might just work. But the one thing that is clear is we can't go back to the way it was. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in this position at some point in the future. Maybe that's the way it is. But this idea that there will be a consolidation in the aviation sector has been something that's probably been bandied around for 10 years, if not more. It's certainly possible, it's certainly feasible, and maybe it's something that's worth looking at.
Yeah. Any other questions coming in, Carolyn?
Yes, sorry if I'm clicking in and out and people are feeling like I'm a jack in the box. I'm trying to preserve as much bandwidth as possible so that we can focus on the conversation. A lot of questions again about touching on and asking for expansion on the questions you raised about the countries that come back and domestic and the implications and what we need to be thinking about if it's starting local, going to domestic, and then those returning markets and where you should invest your time, John. So any further expansion on those or thoughts on which market should we be targeting, when, how, all of those questions?
Yeah, good question. And again, it depends entirely on who you are. These are very, very broad indicators just to show that this is the sort of thinking that needs to go behind any sort of move towards any growth in the future. It's not just which market, it's also which segment within each market. Are they families with kids? What do you need to offer them in terms of safety and security if they're traveling like that? Are they young 18, 20, 22-year-olds traveling in a small pack? They've got a different outlook on all of this. So all I'm really trying to say is that, hey, we've got this information that we can look at, we can adapt as we need, but it's not going to solve the issue for us. We seem to have lost the ability to think. If something comes up, oh, I'll look it up. Well, no, here's something where you can't look it up. You've got to take this information, that information, that information, think about it, put it into the context that you're familiar with, and then try and develop a strategy and a tactic going forward. There's one chap, I forget his name, but he's written a series of books talking about the non-obvious trends. And that's really what we're sort of looking at now. What is there in here that is not apparent at first glance, but which really might be my route out of this, non-obvious trends. To find those non-obvious trends, you've got to have a lot of information. And the problem is that in travel and tourism, our information is pretty ordinary. It's pretty light and it's pretty basic. The measure that we use for success is how many tourists. Well, I'm suggesting that maybe a focus should be, okay, we need a certain number, but we need for them to extend their stay in the country by 1 night or 2 nights. If we shift our thinking to how long in country as a measure, then maybe we've got a different angle on how to actually approach certain markets and which ones to approach. At the moment, we say that 1 Italian is equivalent to 1 Australian, which is equivalent to 1 Brit, which is equivalent to 1 Canadian. Well, it's not, because a Canadian might spend 10 nights, the Brit might spend 15, the Australian might spend 7, etc., etc. So in one sense, we're looking at the wrong metric. Recovery really needs to be about a different metric as well as how many. But we need to understand it. Now, we've already got this mechanism in place. You swipe your passport on the way in, you swipe it on the way out, bingo, you've got an exact nationality, Australian, length of time in country, so many days, so many hours, whatever. It's already being collected. Why isn't it being disseminated to the industry, to people who can actually use that to their advantage? Beats me. But we need to think about that sort of thing.
Is it the cost of that data? So just as you're talking there, I'm thinking about a data set like Forward Keys. Forward Keys have got this data set where you've actually got a proxy for the nationality. You know whether they're on business or leisure. You know whether they're traveling in a group of 1 or 5. You've got a really rich amount of data. You know how much time they're spending in that stopover airport. They're there for 5 hours and they're going into Terminal 1 and they're going out of Terminal 5 for their next flight on their return journey home. they've got all of that data, but in my opinion, it ain't cheap. It's really not. It's incredibly valuable, but it's not cheap. Is that part of the challenge here? Is that there needs to be some kind of a structure for the better sharing of that data for everybody's interests?
I think it's a better sharing. I mean, the data is already being collected. I mean, that's not an issue. And your chip in your passport gives those details, arrival, entry. It's a simpler algorithm to work out how many days or nights or whatever in country. So it's already there. We talk about big data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we're pathetic. We're bad at it because we've got all of these data sets flying around, but they're not being consolidated and they're not being distributed to the sector that can do the most with it. So, we're simply wasting time and wasting a lot of money trying to proxy that when you've got actual counts at your border. Crazy.
What about as well? When you were talking about domestic travel there, Carolyn raised the point. I read on the news this morning that Jacinta in New Zealand is looking at the possibility of creating a bubble, which seems to be the buzzword at the moment, a bubble with Australia, which, I kind of get it. There's a lot of talk about these bubbles at the moment in the UK. It's a bubble. For the listeners out there that have no idea what I'm talking about, it's that, you might have two households that agree, you're going to basically take that risk and you're going to mix with each other, but nobody else. So you're in a bubble together, therefore you are in some way protected. Do you think that there is a real possibility that part of the recovery will be different countries will create bubbles with each other? So New Zealand and Australia both will agree they're going to work together. They're going to have relatively free movement between the two countries for tourism purposes in a way that they can at least protect their tourism industry. Do you think that relationships like that will actually happen, and will they be effective?
I think they're certainly worth looking at. It sounds like a great idea. Whether it's practical in the long term, I don't know, but it's certainly worth considering and needs to be explored. I think it's a great idea. Yep. We need more of those ideas, and then we control them. Yep. We'll find something eventually that works.
Yep. Very good. Carolyn, any other?
Yes, but the questions are still, I'm afraid, throwing thick and fast. So if you're looking to head off for that glass of wine or a cup of tea, John, no luck. A really nice one from Nigel, actually, in the UK, saying, speaking from a UK perspective, the issue of people not getting their refunds and what that does to the issue of trust in the long run, and how we. How anyone's ever going to give us their money ever again when, even if we were promised we could get our money back, we can't get our money back.
That's a massive problem over here, John. I don't know if you sort of are seeing evidence of that as well, but certainly in the UK, that's horrendous at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue. That's the other group that I think could do quite well out of this. We see the insurance companies could longer term. I think the lawyers are going to have a field day as well. But having said that, you need to understand that by withholding a lot of those refunds, that's the only thing that's keeping these companies afloat. If they go under, bye-bye is your refund. So maybe it's okay to be annoyed and irritated by it, but with the prospect of getting some return later, rather than seeing it just totally go away. But it is an issue, and it comes back to a very, very significant point in modern marketing, and that is trust. How do you trust those that are giving you money?
It's almost an existential crisis, though, here in the UK, because that the trust is being eroded. So what you have, and like I say, I don't know if this is played out elsewhere around the world, but as you were just sort of saying there, John, the world's airlines and tourism companies are holding on to literally billions of pounds and dollars worth of cash that doesn't belong to them because it's for travel services that haven't been provided. You've got consumers who might have booked in good faith wanting to travel, that now maybe they've lost their jobs, they've lost their income, and actually they can't afford to travel. They need that cash. Now, is it right? Whilst I understand both sides of the question there, what you're finding is the consumers are saying, look, I want there to be a travel industry, absolutely, and I feel for you in the travel industry, but I need the $8,000 from that holiday that I've paid out for. That's not going to be happening because, frankly, I haven't got any other income. So I've given you that in good trust. In countries like the UK, there's the bonding schemes where you're told, your money guaranteed. If the holiday doesn't happen, you get the cash back. And what the British consumers are realizing is all of that bonding and promises means nothing because they're not getting the cash. You've got the likes of Ryanair and other airlines who are saying, yeah, we'll do the refunds, but it's going to take months. We've got a huge backlog. And we all know, it takes 2 clicks of a mouse to give a refund. That's not a good enough reason, but it's just that we are all collectively keeping the airlines and the tourism industry afloat. Is that right? Should the governments be doing more to try and help the industry in that way? I don't know.
Well, ethically and morally, you would argue that that's not right. But financially, you would argue, or could argue, that it's the only way through at this moment. But this really seems like an action that needs to be taken by the government, where maybe they can buy markers, give that sort of amount of money to the person who outlaid it in the first place, but the government holds that market. It's pretty hard then to turn around and tell the government that we're not going to pay you. But that's if that company remains solvent. If it doesn't, then all those markers are gone.
It was interesting when you were saying about the legal. Sorry, it's telling me my network's slow as well. We're talking about the legal implications. What we're seeing now in the UK is a number of these law firms are coming out, a bit like the PPI situation, saying, did you pay out for a holiday that hasn't been delivered? Have you not received your refund? No win, no fee. We'll take it on, and we're starting to see a proliferation of those, which I don't think anybody really wants to see that. But again, in the absence of the government coming in saying, look, we're going to change the law under exceptional circumstances whereby travel companies actually can have 6 months before processing your refund, or 50% of the refund has to be paid out straight away, or something like that. In the absence of the government stepping up, what else can happen? And now people will turn to these legal firms and try and get whatever they can.
Well, that's going to happen. There's no two ways about that. But that's going to clog the legal system up, and that's going to slow things down dramatically. You could be talking years before you get your money back, and you need it now. So there's the ethical dilemma. But unfortunately, in business today, ethics and morality don't seem to count.
Well, they don't, but I think the point on all of that is, if you're not going to get, if as a consumer, you're not going to get your money back, why am I going to trust any travel company that's looking for me to book to travel somewhere in the future? I don't trust them. If I'm looking at going to Australia and paying, I don't know, £4,000 or £5,000, wow, I'm going to have to think very carefully before I part with that cash. And maybe we're going to see shorter lead times as a result of that. What do you think?
Certainly could do that, but I think there are going to be very significant legal changes to the way these things can operate should this sort of event occur in the future. What that looks like at the moment, I'm not sure, but it's a tenuous situation. It's a difficult situation because the company that's holding on to that money is employing people. But those that are unemployed need that money. So where do you balance out? Well, okay, we'll have to get rid of you and you lose your jobs, but we'll give the money to them. Heck, where do you find that middle ground?
Jed, there's a huge conundrum. Jed, I've got one more question here, actually from Chris Flynn, who's being very polite and sitting in the background, which is most unusual, I'd have to say. Jed, what about transit passengers? Will they be quarantined at connecting points? What about transferring onto other airlines that may have different procedures, lack of consistency, etc.? Any thoughts on this as an issue?
Well, for me, I've got huge worries on that because we talked before about the changing security protocols around the world after 9/11, and any of us who travel regularly, get bemused constantly by what I can carry through security in Manchester Airport and how that differs in parts of Asia and in parts of North America. You know, in airports in the UK and for most of Europe, I don't need to take off my shoes. In the US, I absolutely have to take off my shoes. There's no consistency on the security side. So, you know, John, question for you, why would there be any consistency on the health and hygiene side in the world's airports as we move forward?
Initially, I don't think there will be. I think it will be like a real scramble. But over time, if we get a consolidation of the airlines, then that consolidation can lead to a standardization of these sorts of processes and policies. But it's going to be sequential. It's not going to all happen at once. It's going to be a mess for some time until we can work out what this new aviation sector is going to look like.
Yeah, and I suppose again this probably links again with what we were talking about before there with regards to bubbles. You know, if you have agreed relationships, and I guess this would be industry led with the likes of IATA, but if you have agreed protocols with, you know, between Australia and New Zealand and maybe some of the South Pacific islands, and you agree all of the necessary protocols for health and hygiene in airports and for transport generally, then maybe you can facilitate freedom of travel between there. I think it's quite interesting because typically when we talk about freedom of travel, it's linked with bilaterals, open skies agreements, and maybe it's that level of it, a new type of open skies agreement, which will need to be generated, but it's more to do with the health and hygiene and sterile environments that we're going to need for the future.
It also may mean that we're going to see more long distance direct. We're not going to see the bouncing through Middle East or West Asia.
That's a really interesting point.
Direct, you know, that they've been happening for some time. A little bit easier to manage, but still difficulties at each end. But at least you're in one aircraft for the duration. Maybe there's more of that.
It's intriguing that, John, actually, because when we've been looking at these longer haul flights, you know, this non-stop that Qantas are doing between London Heathrow and Perth, and it's, I don't know, 18 or 19 hours. And initially, a lot of the sort of feeling that I was sort of hearing was, you know, it's too long to be on one flight. I'd rather go through an airport in the Middle East. And yeah, I'm with you, John. Right now, I'd rather be on a 19-hour flight than going through a major hub that is attracting carriers from all over the world. Yeah, that's a really good point.
It's a tough one.
It is.
I just added a comment on that. That flight, a lot of people felt the same as you, and I was very skeptical, but Qantas have filled that as probably their highest capacity airline. It was flying at 90% capacity plus prior to this.
Oh, yes. Wow. That's incredible, isn't it?
John's face is a picture.
90%.
That's incredible.
Ooh, that's a dream. Wow.
That said, I've got to say on that one, Carolyn, I don't know what the aircraft is. I noticed that we have KK from ASM in Malaysia. He might be able to step in and sort of give us his take on this. I'm not sure what the aircraft was, but I seem to recall that the configuration was pretty low density in terms of seating for that long haul flight. So whilst it might be kind of 90% occupancy, I'm or seat capacity, I'm not sure what the actual capacity on that flight was. I don't think it's as many as would normally be on that aircraft type, but I would need an aviation person to come in and help us out with that one.
I can't tell you the exact number, but your suspicion is absolutely right, Jed. The capacity was lower, but not probably about 10 to 15% lower.
Okay.
But the prices reflect, and this is, I think, maybe you've touched on something interesting, which is it's perhaps a tester for our post-COVID world, because I was a little skeptical. Australians are both about the most demanding consumers in the world, about the most tightwad. And I was very skeptical as to whether they would pay for that flight, but they proved willing to do so in those and at both ends of the route, obviously, not just the outbound, but people proved willing to pay that premium to have that combination of a little bit more space and that direct through flight. And, you know, Qantas, I do think are one of the best modelers of revenue on some of this, and very ruthless about those things in a good way of ruthless. So it is lower, but that's why I think it might present quite a good case study for the kind of things that we need to be thinking about going forward. I do have an answer from Key. He's saying it's a 787-900 with 236 passengers.
Thank you very much, KK. I knew you'd come up with the goods for us there. I saw you on the list, and I appreciate that. Thanks very much for stepping that up. I'd also like to know, what's the usual capacity on a 787-9 series? Is that especially adjusted for that particular flight? Just be interested to know what that is. But thank you very much for coming up with that.
I think that's actually lower than that's actually a bigger gap from normal than I thought, but I'll let KK come through with the actual numbers on that, because he's probably got them in front of him.
Yeah, he'll have them off the top of his head. I know KK, he knows his stuff on aviation and then some. Super stuff. Any other questions that we haven't tackled yet?
No, I think pretty much so far we've reached the point on everything now, Jed, which is and actually I'd like, probably as the producer, because it's always a bit disconcerting if you're seeing people shed too fast. I'd like to thank so many people for staying around again for another 45 minutes while we chat this through.
Yeah, fair play. We've kept quite a few people here.
And while we're at that, I would like to thank all of you for actually developing this series and for inviting me to be a presenter. I appreciate that very much. I think what you're doing is essential and very, very practical and useful. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you. I think we will wrap it up at that point. So thanks a million, John, for another outstanding presentation. Really insightful, and I think we've all learned a huge amount. Thanks to all of our viewers and listeners out there for spending some time with us, and for all of your great questions. We really appreciate that. As I mentioned at the outset, we will be posting the webinar up online in the WeTAC group pages on LinkedIn and Facebook later this evening, this morning. And please do join us for our 4th episode in the series, which will be this Thursday, the 7th of May, where we're going to be hearing from our very own Carolyn Childs, who's the CEO of My Travel Research and, of course, the producer of this series. And Carolyn is going to be talking to us about how we can use marketing to not only survive during this crisis, but to actually thrive in this new abnormal, as Carolyn always says. So please do join us this Thursday. The times for it will be 1600 Sydney time, 1400 Singapore, 7 a.m. London, 2 a.m. New York, and if you're on the west coast of the US, it's 2300 on Wednesday. Final thanks again to all of our supporters. This series has been hosted by myself, Jed Brown of Low Season Traveller, and the producer is Carolyn Childs of My Travel Research. Have a great day, everyone, and see you all this Thursday. Thanks a million. So there we have it. Our huge thanks again go to John Koldowski from Lashan University for providing us with his insights this week. The full episode can be viewed online at wtach.org, and you can register for the future episodes, which will be running throughout May on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The 4th special episode in this series is with Carolyn Childs, who's one of the tourism industry's foremost marketing gurus, and she'll be providing us with her insights into how we can survive and thrive in tourism during this new normal which we find ourselves in. Until then, have a great week, stay healthy, stay safe, stay home, and don't forget to share this podcast with your friends, family, and social networks. Our content will always be free for everyone, as we believe that travel is better without the crowds.